happy things make you happier and sad things make you less sad. Of course you're uncertain and anxious because you don't know what the hell is going on and you don't know where you are and you don't know what to do, which you really need to know, because if you get 49 rejections, it's not because you're useless, it's because the baseline for rejection is 98%. No one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. What do you mean, just? Your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. You could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. No goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. Your culture is a set of value-laden presuppositions that you orient yourself in the world that match the set of value-laden presuppositions that everyone in your culture has and acts out. And so what that means is that when you believe something and you're among your own people, you believe something implicitly. It's the way you look at the world, it's the way you act things out. You act them out, everyone expects you to act them out. They're happy about it, in fact. So there's a match between what you're doing, what you see and what you're doing, and what other people expect. And it's that match that regulates your emotions. It's not the belief system, it's the match. And so part of the reason that people are so tied to their cultural identity is because their cultural identity regulates their emotions. And in a profound way, this is no joke, one of the things that stabilizes human nervous systems is, well, imagine that you have a domain of competence. There's many domains of competence, and of course, in some of those domains you're completely incompetent, but they may not matter because you don't go into that domain. So you have some area of specialization, which you might think of as your sub-tribe, your university students, and so some of you are lower status by the rules of the university game, and some of you are higher status by the rules of the university game, by the tribe, and so the higher status people tend to be the ones who fit into the academic environment, and find it conducive to their mode of being, and who also do well, and their serotonin levels rise, and the neurochemicals that moderate mood, particularly, are serotonergic. It's serotonin. It's lots of other things. It's an oversimplification, but that'll do for now. As you become dominant in a hierarchy, your serotonin levels rise. And what that means is that happy things make you happier and sad things make you less sad. It tunes your nervous system. So if you're down at the bottom of the hierarchy and you're failing, it's like, hey, hardly anything makes you happy and everything makes you nervous. And it's no wonder, because it's not very good down there. So the societal structure, which is an elaborated dominance hierarchy, regulates your emotions because of the match between your expectations and the behaviors of the people within that structure. And then your position within the hierarchy regulates the ratio, let's say, and the intensity between positive and negative emotion. So you mess with people's status at your peril, and you disrupt their culture. They don't like that. And no wonder, because when it's disrupted, they fall into chaos. And chaos isn't just anxiety. I mean, anxiety is bad enough, but it's not just anxiety, because when you fall into chaos, when things fall apart for you, of course you're uncertain and anxious because you don't know what the hell is going on, and you don't know where you are, and you don't know what to do. That's anxiety provoking, and maybe you can't even understand your past properly anymore. That, as I said, that happens when people get betrayed. And so you fall into this state where nothing is certain. The way you construe the world isn't certain, and even the way the world is no longer certain, because you don't know how to act or your actions aren't working, and so the world is presenting itself as something that's chaotic. It's not just psychological. The chaos is a weird intermingling of the chaotic world and the chaotic self. I mean, that's what happens when you get unemployed. It's like, it's devastating, right? It's devastating to people. And you could say, well, that's psychological. It's like, well, yeah, but they're unemployed. That makes the world far more incomprehensible and uncertain. It's not just psychological. It's psychological, and that's bad, but it's also real, and that's even worse. And then those two things can spiral, which they often do, because, you know, if you don't set your expectations properly for a job search and assume that you're going to get 49 rejections for every interview, which you really need to know, because if you get 49 rejections, it's not because you're useless, it's because the baseline for rejection is 98%. And that's okay, because the base rate for rejection for everything is 98%, no matter what you do. But you need to know that so that you don't feel that it's like something wrong with you. And of course, you only have to get it right once, then you have a job. It's a lottery, but you have to set yourself up. You have to think, okay, well, I'm going to look for a job. I need to, how many resumes can I tolerate sending out a day? You know, it has to be enough so you don't feel like a useless moron, and it can't be so many that you're overwhelmed by the burden. So, and I help people do this sort of thing all the time. So maybe you decide, well, you're going to send out 10 a day, and you're going to work 2 hours on it, and it's going to take 6 months. And then, you know, you got your parameters set properly, and you know what to expect in the world, and your emotions are regulated. And so, but the state of being unemployed doesn't just produce psychological consequences. So the distinction between the psyche and the world, in some sense, is quite arbitrary. And the psychoanalysts, I think, err too much on the side of the subject. They tend to think that too much of you is inside of you, and too little of you is outside of you. And part of the reason I believe that is because of my clinical experience. I love the psychoanalysts, man. They're brilliant, they're deep. They grapple with real problems, like with the problems, when people have real problems, and I mean profound problems, they're really profound moral problems. They're problems of good and evil, really. You know, there are things going on in their family that are so terrible that, well, that they're sometimes fatal, you know, lie upon lie upon lie upon lie for decades and decades and decades. It's awful. And that's not exactly inside them. It's out there in the world. And lots of the people that I see, very famous critic of psychology, I can't remember his name, but I probably will, criticize the practice of psychology quite effectively I believe in the early 60s. The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z. It's a classic. You should read it. If you're interested in psychology, read it. Like, it's a classic. And he basically said, most people have problems in living. They don't have psychological problems. And so I've experienced, despite my love for the psychoanalysts, very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work. You know, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, like, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up. Whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. And eat something in the morning. What sort of life would you have to have so that you could bear your suffering nobly? That's a good question to ask yourself. Now, and so we have people just write for 15 minutes. If you could have what you wanted and needed, What might that look like? And there's an instruction there too, is do it badly. Because what the hell do you know? And besides, your vision's going to change as you progress through your life. And so you're not going to get it done perfectly, but that's okay. Get it down. Get a rough first draft down, right? A rough approximation of who you could be if you got your act together. Not who other people think you should be, you know? Although that might enter into it because you don't want to be completely... You can't be who you are properly and ignore the fact that you're embedded in a social context. And so you have to take the fact that there are other people into account. And it doesn't mean be who your parents think you should be either, even though that's another source of information that you might want to consider. It's a deeper question. It's like, what would actually motivate you? And you might think, well, I could never have that. It's like, that's not the question that's being addressed here. Although I would say, there's no sense floating off into some kind of impossible juvenile fantasy. And we're making an assumption that you're taking the question seriously and that you're going to remain within the bounds of what you regard as sanely reasonable. So that's the first part. Second part was the opposite of that. It's like, okay, now you've specified a goal. Right? The goal is, in some sense, both your character and your life. And you've specified that rather vaguely. You only had 15 minutes to write about it. And that's a good thing because now you have something to move toward. Now, I could tell you this technically. This is an interesting thing to know. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. It's, what do you mean, just? Like, there isn't anything harder than that. So you can't just say just, that's all you want. You just want to be happy all the time. That's all it would take. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to happen. So you can get rid of the just. And then, I want to be happy. Well, maybe. Actually, what people really mean when they say that is they don't want to suffer and be miserable. So really what they mean is they don't want to experience excess negative emotion. And you can find that out if you carefully question people and carefully analyze the answers. You find out they're actually more concerned about avoiding the catastrophic negative than living in a world of hedonistic delight. Now, you also find that while avoiding the catastrophic tragedy, they wouldn't mind having a little bit of hedonistic delight. And so some happiness is interleaved in there. Then you might ask yourself, to the degree that people do want hedonistic delight when they're being happy, what does happy mean? And you might think, well, happy means getting what you want. Happy is how you feel after Christmas dinner. It's like, no, that's asleep. Right? That's content and asleep. Now that's a form of contentment, but it isn't really what people mean when they say that they want to be happy. The happiness that people refer to when they talk about happiness has more to do with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is an interesting word because it means it's entheos. It means to be inspired. Inspired is in spirit. It means to be imbued with the Spirit. Well, enthusiastic is to be imbued with the Spirit of God, interestingly enough. And we'll return to that. When do you experience the positive emotion that's associated with happiness? The answer is, not when you've attained a goal, but when you're pursuing one. So you're set up, your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. You could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. And so your emotions are very tightly tied to your action. Freeze, retreat, negative. Advance towards a goal, positive. No goal, no positive emotion. Now, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that's a good thing to remember. No goal, no positive emotion. A corollary of that as well is no goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. And that begs a question, well, what should the goal be? And that's partly what we're trying to establish. You wrote for 15 minutes, you try to develop a vision for your life. Now you have something to move toward. That sets up the precondition for potential positive emotion and happiness. What else do you need to motivate you? Well, how about negative emotion? So what do you do with that? Well, negative emotion can stop you. You might think, well, I'd like to get a better job, but I'm afraid of putting myself out in the job market. I'm afraid of being evaluated. I'm afraid that if I tried something more difficult, I might fail. Then you have your negative emotion opposing you, right? It's anxiety is stopping you. And fair enough, because there are things to be anxious about. But what if you could get your negative emotion behind you, pushing you instead of stopping you? And they were often afraid to. And they had their reasons. They didn't want to contemplate their resumes. They didn't want to open up their CVs. They didn't want to face the inadequacies of their past. They were afraid of being evaluated. They were afraid of being rejected. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to conduct themselves in an interview. They were afraid of losing the security they'd already built up. They had their fears, and they were real, and those fears stopped them. But they'd come to me and say, oh my God, I'm so miserable. My life is so miserable. And we'd take that apart. And one of the reasons was because they were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And then we'd talk that through and they'd say, well, I'm afraid to make a change. And I'd say, well, that's okay. That's understandable. How afraid are you of not making a change? Let's make a little vision of that. You're 35, you hate your job. What's the consequence? You're not motivated. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You're starting to get depressed. You're getting bitter. You're getting resentful. You're getting cynical. You're amotivated at work. You're not doing a very good job. And you're starting to shrink. Now play that out for 10 years. You don't change it. You don't fix it. And what happens? Well, it's not like it's going to get better of its own accord. What's going to happen to you? Well, for sure, at minimum, what's going to happen to you is you're going to be in the same situation, but 10 years older. And if you can't get out of that situation now, what the hell makes you think you're going to get out of it in 10 years? You're 10 years older, you're 10 years more bitter, you're 10 years more cynical. Maybe by that time your marriage has collapsed because who the hell wants to live with you? You're even more of a slave than you were because you've labored another 10 years under the thumb of the tyrant and stepped backwards every time you were asked to, so you got smaller and smaller as the tyrant got bigger and bigger. It's like, think about that, and that means imagine it. Imagine that, okay? Now that's the situation. You're stuck where you are, but it's 10 years from now. And when I say think of that, I mean imagine that. It's like really play it out. It's like, you know how miserable you are now? You're afraid of making the necessary changes, but you know how miserable you are now. Just imagine how miserable you could be in 10 years. And in all likelihood, what you'll find is that you're way more afraid of that than you are of whatever's stopping you in the present. It's really useful to know what your own particular brand of hell might be. And so one of the things we do in this writing exercise is have people do the reverse. Like, okay, so imagine now, 5 years from now, you've let whatever temptations you're particularly susceptible to have the upper hand. And they've augured you into the ground. One person's an alcoholic, another person's a criminal, another person's living on the street, someone else is like skirting the edges of prostitution, somebody else is narcissistic and bitter, somebody else is depressed and anxious. You know where you would fall off the edge of the earth if you fell off in whatever direction you're prone to fall off. Everyone knows that, but we avoid that. That's rule 3. do not hide things in the fog. Is that the rule? Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, we often won't allow ourselves to imagine the catastrophe that we're pursuing. Let's say through inaction. That's a good thing to fix. So now you say, well, you think for 15 minutes, that's not very long, about who you could be and what you could have if you could have what you wanted, if you were who you could be. And then you think about what sort of hell you could produce for yourself if you didn't do that. And that's not a bad polarity. It's like, I'm going to get away from that and I'm going to move towards that. And then you have your negative emotion working for you and your positive emotion working for you. And that's a good gradient. And that's a great gradient emotionally because, as I said, you don't experience positive emotion except in relationship to a goal. And if you got a nice gradient on your goal pursuit, then that's going to increase the degree to which you feel positive emotion. And positive emotion, by the way, isn't just about being happy. That's the most trivial part of it in some sense. Positive emotion allows you to focus. It's the soul of concentration. It's the essence of enthusiastic motivation. When you say, I really want to do that, that statement is predicated on the existence of positive emotion. It's the fact that the goal beckons to you that makes you say, I want to do that. And you know how much easier it is to do something you want to do than to do something you don't want to do. And that ease is actually a consequence of the activation of the system that governs positive emotion. And you might ask yourself, well, how powerful a system is that? And I would say, well, almost all of the drugs of abuse that people are most prone to abusing are abused because they activate the positive emotion system. So cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin is also a painkiller, but it has a psychomotor stimulant element. That's the technical term for the pharmacological effect of pharmacological agents on the positive emotion system. Psychomotor stimulation. Psychomotor because it's associated with movement forward. And cocaine is such a powerful drug because it makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. That's the system it hyperactivates. And so it's a primary system of motivation. It's as old as forward movement itself. It's a cardinal source of meaning. And it only manifests itself in relationship to a goal.
We had a conversation before and it reached tens of millions of people. And as I went through the feedback and the comments of that conversation, I found one that really stood out to me. Someone said, I had just days of will left in my body. I felt like a failure. I hadn't reached the potential I knew I had in me. Despite effort, I couldn't become the person I was so desperate to become. And then I found Jordan. And his unfiltered words pulled me from my darkest moment just in time. Now my life is in my hands once again, and I've built a career and a life I'm proud of. So thank you, Jordan. We may never meet, but you've saved my life, and my children still have their father because of you. It is one hell of an impact that you've had on just that single person's life. How do you receive such incredible feedback from a stranger you've never met?
Well, when you were reading that, it's obviously a very positive thing to hear, but my mind immediately went to why that's the case. See, I've been in the fortunate position of being able to synthesize and then communicate a century's worth of clinical research and experience gathered by very many extremely intelligent and careful people. And then on top of that, whatever I've managed to gather being reasonably educated in the broader sphere of the humanities and sciences, let's say. And the effect that this individual is attributing to me is a consequence of that, right? I've been successful because I've been a conduit of good ideas, and I have the ability to synthesize a lot of information and to communicate that to people in a way that's understandable. The person who made that comment, they were struggling for one reason or another, and one of the things you do with people who are struggling is you make the simple even simpler, because then they can get a toehold. You know, like if they're really barely able to move. I had one client, you know, he had a hard life, man. He was like 85. He'd fallen off a ladder and broken his neck, and they had permanently fused it. So he was basically like this. He could hardly move. He was so depressed. He literally couldn't get out of bed. You know, it was awful. And he was in chronic pain because of his broken neck. And so, you know, the first thing I did with him was get him to sit up for like 30 seconds. That was it. That's where he had to start, you know. And after, I worked with him when he was in the hospital. After 2 weeks, he was walking down the hall and able to sit up and read for, you know, 5 or 6 minutes. And he got out of the hospital. He went home. But he had to start with the simplest possible steps. And hey, man, this is the definition of humility in some ways, is that you start progressing where you can start.